3 years ago, my father looked me straight in the eyes from across a polished hospital waiting room and told me my treatment wasn't financially realistic. Yesterday, that same man sat trembling outside my office, holding a stack of papers with my sister's name on them, begging me to undo a signature that never should have existed in the first place. If you've ever been the child your family learned to survive without, the one expected to quietly disappear whenever someone else needed the spotlight, then you'll probably understand exactly what this story feels like. And honestly, before I tell you how my father ended up outside my office looking 20 years older than the last time I saw him, I want to know where you're listening from tonight. Because somewhere out there, someone else is sitting with a phone in their hand waiting for a parent to choose them for once. Mi name is Claire Donovan. I'm 32 years old. And 6 months ago, Forbes called me one of the fastest rising executives in biotech funding. But none of that mattered when I opened my office door yesterday morning and saw my father standing there in the hallway, looking small for the first time in my life. Michael Donovan had always been the kind of man who filled every room he entered. Tall, controlled, expensive gray suits, a voice that never needed to rise because everyone adjusted themselves around it automatically. Growing up, my father treated emotions the way accountants treat rounding errors. If something couldn't be measured, controlled, or justified on paper, he dismissed it. And unfortunately for me, I was born into a family where practicality had a hierarchy. My younger sister Emily was considered an investment. I was considered durable. Emily had bright blonde hair, perfect teeth, and the kind of personality strangers immediately trusted. She cried easily. Dad loved that about her. Said it made people want to protect her. Meanwhile, I learned early how to sit quietly in emergency rooms without asking for too much. How to apologize before I needed help. How to become low maintenance enough that nobody noticed when I was hurting. Yesterday morning, my assistant buzzed my office and said, "Claire, there's a man here asking for you. He says it's urgent." I looked through the glass wall, overlooking downtown Chicago, and saw my father sitting stiffly in the reception chair, clutching a blue hospital folder so tightly the edges had bent inward under his fingers. He stood the second he saw me. Not proud. Not angry. Afraid. And that terrified me more than if he'd walked in shouting, "Claire," he said quietly, his voice cracking in a way I'd never heard before. "Emily needs your help." Then he slid the folder across my desk, and the moment I saw the signature on the final page, my stomach dropped. The signature belonged to my father. I recognized it instantly. Michael Donovan signed everything the same way. Sharp downward angle on the M, heavy pressure on the final stroke like he was carving ownership into the page itself. Even as a kid, I used to sit at the kitchen island watching him sign mortgage papers, investment forms, birthday checks for Emily's dance competitions. Back then, his signature felt powerful, permanent, like the world rearranged itself after his pen touched paper. But the document sitting in front of me wasn't a mortgage or a school loan. It was a financial transfer authorization connected to Emily's treatment trust. And buried halfway down page 4 was the date. My chest tightened. June 14th. 3 years ago, the exact same day, I sat alone in St. Mary's Oncology Center, staring at an estimate for my first round of treatment while trying not to panic hard enough to throw up in the hospital restroom. My father must have seen the color drain from my face because he leaned forward quickly. "Claire, listen to me before you say anything." but I wasn't hearing him anymore. I was already back there, back in that freezing consultation room with fake landscape paintings on the walls and a nurse named Patricia explaining numbers that sounded too large to belong to one human life. $86,000 up front before insurance adjustments. I remember nodding like I understood while my hands went numb under the table. I remember walking outside afterward into the parking garage because I couldn't breathe in front of strangers anymore. And I remembered making exactly one phone call. Dad answered on the third ring. Distracted. Impatient. I could hear music and glasses clinking somewhere in the background. Claire, can this wait? We're celebrating. I asked him what they were celebrating. He laughed softly like the answer should have been obvious. Emily finalized the launch for her wellness brand. Big investors came through. Then I told him about the treatment, about the urgency, about the deposits. Silence. Not shocked silence. Calculating silence. The kind my father always used before delivering bad news, dressed as practicality. Claire, he finally said carefully, your sister's contracts are already locked in. We moved money this morning. Pulling assets now would create serious penalties. I remember gripping the steering wheel so hard my palm left crescent marks against the leather. Dad, this is treatment. Another pause. Then quietly, almost annoyed, he said the sentence that rearranged my understanding of family forever. Emily's future can still grow. We can't afford to gamble both daughters at once. Back in my office, my father lowered himself slowly into the chair across from me, like the memory physically hurt him too. I didn't know things would turn out this way, he said. Outside the glass walls, Chicago moved normally. Taxis. People crossing intersections. Someone laughing down the hallway. The whole world continuing while mine tilted sideways all over again. I looked back down at the file and noticed something I had missed before. Attached behind the authorization form was a denial notice from Emily's insurance provider. Coverage revoked due to trust restructuring and asset reallocation linked to prior transfers. Prior transfers. My father followed my eyes and immediately stood up. Claire, he said sharply, panic finally bleeding into his voice. You cannot tell Emily about that document. For a moment, neither of us moved. My father stood beside my desk with one hand pressed flat against the leather chair like he needed something solid to keep himself upright. The late afternoon sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind me, throwing long shadows across the office. But his face looked strangely pale under the light. Older. Fragile. In a way I had never associated with Michael Donovan. All my life, my father had been the person other people leaned on. The man relatives called during divorces, bankruptcies, layoffs. He always had answers, always had control, but standing there now, staring at that insurance denial notice, he looked like someone watching a bridge collapse beneath his own feet. Emily thinks the coverage issue is temporary, he said quietly. She doesn't know why the trust was flagged. I leaned back slowly in my chair, studying him. But you do. He closed his eyes for half a second. That tiny hesitation told me more than the words ever could. Outside my office, someone wheeled a catering cart down the hallway, dishes rattling softly against each other. The sound reminded me of hospitals. Everything suddenly did stainless steel. Coffee gone cold. Quiet panic hidden under professional smiles. Claire? my father said carefully, lowering himself back into the chair. There are things you do not understand about what happened back then. I almost laughed at that. Back then, as if trauma was a season someone eventually packed into storage boxes. Help me understand, then, I said. Explain to me how my treatment became negotiable. His jaw tightened. It was not supposed to go that far. There it was again. That language, passive, detached. Like terrible things simply drifted into existence on their own. I stared at him for a long moment before asking the question I had apparently carried inside me for 3 years. Did you ever think I might not survive? He looked away immediately. Not dramatisch. Not emotional. Just instinctive avoidance. And somehow that hurt more than if he had shouted. The silence stretched between us, heavy and crowded with every unanswered phone call, every delayed text, every holiday spent pretending our family was simply busy instead of broken. Finally, he spoke so quietly, I almost missed it. Your mother believed you were stronger than Emily. I felt something cold settle into my chest. Not anger anymore. Something worse. Recognition. Because suddenly the entire architecture of my childhood made sense. Emily cried, so people rescued her. I endured, so people used me. My father rubbed a hand across his face before continuing, Your mother thought if resources became limited, Emily would fall apart. So I became expendable. No, he snapped quickly, genuine emotion cracking through his voice for the first time. That is not what this was. But his eyes betrayed him. Because somewhere deep down, that was exactly what this had been. A calculation, a family triage system nobody admitted existed. I looked back down at the file again, forcing myself to focus on facts instead of memories. The transfer authorization, the revoked coverage, the restructuring timeline. Then I noticed another name near the bottom of the paperwork. Not my father's, not Emily's. A third signature listed under witness authorization. I froze. Wait, I said slowly. Why is Dr. Ethan Brooks connected to this file? My father's expression changed instantly. And for the first time since walking into my office, he looked genuinely terrified. The air in my office suddenly felt thinner. Dr. Ethan Brooks was not just some random physician whose name happened to appear on paperwork. Ethan Brooks had been the one person who saw me at my absolute worst and treated me like I still existed beyond it. 3 years ago, when my hair was falling out faster than I could emotionally process, and my apartment smelled permanently like antiseptic wipes and reheated soup, Ethan had walked into my hospital room carrying terrible coffee and sarcasm sharp enough to cut through pity. At the time, he was overseeing clinical funding partnerships for one of the experimental treatment programs connected to St. Mary's. We met because I spent too much time arguing with billing departments and insurance coordinators. He once told me I analyzed medical contracts like someone preparing for war. Maybe I was... Why is his signature on this? I asked again, slower this time. My father swallowed hard. Claire, no. I pushed the file across the desk toward him. You walked into my office asking for help, so you do not get to hide things from me now. He stared down at the papers without touching them. That frightened me more than shouting would have. My father only avoided eye contact when he knew he had already lost control of a situation. Finally, He exhaled heavily and rubbed a hand against his forehead. Ethan was consulted during the trust restructuring. My stomach tightened instantly. Consulted how? Another pause. Outside the office windows, clouds had begun rolling across the Chicago skyline, darkening the glass towers one by one. A storm was moving in, slow, heavy, the kind that makes the whole city feel claustrophobic before the rain even starts. When your treatments became more complicated, my father said carefully, there were discussions about long-term funding options. I stared at him. What discussions? He looked exhausted suddenly. Your mother wanted guarantees. Guarantees for what? His silence answered before his words did. My chest felt hollow. She wanted to know survival odds, I whispered. My father closed his eyes briefly. Claire, I stood up so quickly my chair rolled backward into the bookshelf behind me. You asked doctors to calculate whether I was worth the financial risk? The words came out sharper than I intended, but once they existed in the room, neither of us could pretend otherwise. My father rose immediately too, his voice tightening. That is not what happened. Then explain it to me in a way that sounds better. He looked genuinely distressed now, but the problem with delayed honesty is that by the time it arrives, trust is already buried too deep to dig out cleanly. Your mother was terrified, he said quietly. Emily was struggling financially. You were sick. Everything started collapsing at once. So she picked. No, but again, his eyes betrayed him before his voice could. I turned away from him and walked toward the windows, arms folded tightly across my chest. Below us, tiny figures hurried through crosswalks, carrying umbrellas against rain that had not started yet, everyone preparing for impact before the first drop even hit. That was what my family had always done. They protected Emily before disaster arrived. Me, I was expected to survive disasters already in progress. Behind me, my father spoke again, softer this time. Ethan tried to stop it. I froze. Slowly, I turned back around. Stop what? My father looked at the file on my desk like it physically hurt him to see it. Then he said the sentence that made everything inside me go still. Your mother attempted to remove you from the family trust entirely. The words seemed to echo long after my father stopped speaking. Remove you from the family trust entirely. Not reduce it. Not restructure it. Remove. Like I was an accounting error someone wanted cleaned out before the quarter closed. I stared at him across the office, waiting for the part where he told me I misunderstood, waiting for him to say my mother had panicked, or that lawyers exaggerated things, or that none of it actually happened. But he said nothing. And silence has a way of confirming the things people are too ashamed to say out loud. Rain finally began tapping against the windows behind me. Soft at first, then heavier, streaking the skyline in blurred gray lines. My office suddenly felt smaller than it had an hour ago. Smaller than the hospital rooms I used to sit in pretending not to notice nurses lowering their voices outside my door. When I asked quietly, my father loosened his tie with trembling fingers. A few weeks after your second treatment cycle, I laughed once under my breath, but there was no humor in it. Just disbelief stretched thin enough to sound sharp. So while I was trying to stay alive, Mom was trying to erase me financially. She thought she was protecting the family. From me. His jaw tightened. From losing everything. I turned away before he could see how badly that landed. There are certain sentences that do not hit immediately. They settle slowly, like glass dust in your lungs. You breathe normally at first. Then, suddenly, everything hurts. I walked toward the built-in bar near the back wall and poured water into a crystal glass, mostly because my hands needed something to do besides shake. Across the room, my father looked exhausted in a way I had never witnessed growing up. Not physically tired, morally tired. Like he had spent years holding together a version of our family that finally collapsed under its own weight. "Ethan threatened legal action," he said suddenly. I froze with the glass halfway to my mouth. "What your mother met privately with the trust attorneys. She wanted amendments made before your condition worsened." My stomach turned cold. Condition worsened. Hearing my illness described like a forecast made something inside me recoil. Ethan found out because he was overseeing the medical review attached to the trust restructuring. He told us if we moved forward, he would report everything. I stared at him. Why would he risk that? My father looked genuinely confused by the question. "Because he cared about you." The room went very still after that. 3 years ago, I had been too sick, too exhausted, too consumed with surviving to question why Ethan kept showing up after his shifts ended. Why he sat beside me during chemo appointments long after paperwork was finished. Why he memorized the exact way I took my coffee, even when nausea made me unable to drink half of it. Back then, I told myself he was just kind. Some people are. But now, pieces were rearranging themselves into something far more dangerous. Something personal. My father reached into the folder again and pulled out a sealed envelope I had not noticed before. Thick cream paper. My name written across the front in Ethan's handwriting. The sight of it made my pulse stumble. "He gave me this yesterday," my father said carefully. "Told me if Emily's condition got worse. I was supposed to bring it to you." I slowly took the envelope from his hand. It felt strangely heavy for a single piece of paper. My father stepped back toward the door, his face hollow with regret. "Claire," he said quietly, "before you open that, you need to understand something." He hesitated, like even now he was debating whether the truth would destroy me more than the lie had. Then he looked directly at me and said, "Emily never knew what your mother tried to do. But she did know where the money came from." The office was so quiet, I could hear the rainwater ticking against the windows like a clock counting down toward something irreversible. I stood there holding Ethan's envelope while my father's words settled into me piece by piece. Sharp and slow. Emily knew where the money came from. Not all of it. Maybe not the legal details. Maybe not the trust meetings or the paperwork or the discussions about whether I was financially survivable, but she knew enough. Enough to cash the checks. Enough to keep building a life while mine was dissolving into hospital bills and insurance calls and nights spent pretending exhaustion was temporary. My father lingered near the doorway like he wanted to say something else. But there are moments when language becomes useless. Eventually, he left without another word. The soft click of the office door closing behind him sounded strangely final. I stared at the envelope in my hands for a long time before opening it. Ethan's handwriting was neat. Controlled. Exactly the way I remembered it from prescription notes. He used to leave tape to my fridge because he knew chemo brain made me forget things. Drink water. Eat something real today. Call me if the dizziness gets worse. Tiny instructions stitched quietly into the worst year of my life. My fingers trembled slightly as I unfolded the letter inside. Claire. If you are reading this, then things have gone further than I hoped they would. I warned your father this situation would eventually collapse under the weight of secrecy. There are truths about your treatment, your trust, and your family that were hidden from you because certain people believed protecting you meant controlling information. They were wrong. I sat down hard in my chair. Outside, thunder rolled low across the city, distant but growing closer. The letter continued. 3 years ago, after your second treatment cycle failed to produce expected results, your mother requested a private consultation regarding long-term financial exposure connected to your care. She asked doctors to estimate not only your survival odds, but also projected quality of life outcomes. My stomach twisted so violently I had to put the paper down for a second. Quality of life outcomes. As if my future had become a corporate liability report. I forced myself to keep reading. I objected immediately and documented the meeting. I believed you deserved transparency, but your father insisted you were emotionally fragile and needed stability during treatment. I argued that withholding information would eventually cause greater damage. I was overruled. My chest tightened. Emotionally fragile. The irony almost made me laugh. I had gone to treatments alone half the time because nobody could rearrange schedules. I learned how to drive myself home while nauseous because depending on people felt more dangerous than illness itself. Fragile was never the word anyone used for me. Convenient was. The final paragraph was shorter. Harsher somehow because of it. There is one thing your father still has not told you. Emily attempted to return the money after she found out where it came from. Your mother refused to let her. I stopped breathing for a second. My eyes scanned the sentence again and again, unable to reconcile it with the version of Emily I had carried for years. The golden child, the protected one. The sister who smiled through brand launches and beach vacations, while I sat under fluorescent lights trying not to be afraid. My phone suddenly buzzed across the desk, startling me hard enough that the letter slipped from my hands. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Then a voicemail notification appeared immediately after. 3 seconds later, another one. Then another. My pulse began climbing fast as I pressed play. Static crackled softly before I heard a woman crying. Claire, Emily's voice sounded thin, unsteady, almost unrecognizable. Mom is lying to everyone again. Please do not approve the transfer until you hear what really happened that night at the hospital. By the time I called Emily back, my hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped the phone twice. Rain hammered against the windows, now turning downtown Chicago into a blur of silver and black. The office lights reflected faintly across the glass. And for one disorienting second, I caught my own reflection staring back at me. Pale, exhausted. Looking strangely similar to the woman I used to be 3 years ago, sitting alone under fluorescent hospital lights, pretending she was not terrified of dying. Emily answered on the first ring. I did not even get a chance to speak before she started crying again. Not soft crying. Not graceful crying. The kind that sounds ripped out of someone after years of holding themselves together too tightly. Claire, please, she whispered. You cannot let Mom control this again. I closed my eyes. What happened at the hospital? Silence crackled between us for a few seconds. Then she inhaled shakily. I found out by accident. My stomach tightened. Found out what? About the trust. About the meetings. About you. Her voice cracked hard on the last word. Dad left paperwork in his home office. I was looking for tax documents for the business launch, and I saw your medical estimates attached to transfer requests. I leaned heavily against my desk, pulse pounding, so hard it hurt. Across the city, lightning flashed somewhere beyond the clouds, bright enough to briefly flood the office in white light. Emily kept talking quickly now. Like once the truth started coming out, she could not stop it anymore. Mom told me your treatments were mostly covered. She said you wanted space and privacy. I did not know she was moving money out of your trust. I laughed bitterly under my breath. But you still spent it. A broken sound escaped her throat. I know. There was no defense in her voice. No excuse. Somehow, that made it worse. I tried to give it back after I found out. My chest tightened painfully because Ethan's letter had already warned me this part was true. Mom lost it. Emily continued. She said if the money went back into your medical trust, the family would collapse financially. She said your condition was unstable and she needed to think long-term. Long-term? Families always sound the cruelest when they are trying to sound responsible. I pressed my fingers against my forehead as memories began rearranging themselves violently in my mind. Birthday dinners Emily paid for, but never could have afforded alone. The luxury wellness launch everyone praised online. The beach house photos my mother proudly framed in the living room while I sat in infusion clinics, pretending social media did not hurt to look at. Why did you not tell me? I asked quietly. Emily started crying harder. Because Mom threatened to cut me off completely if I contacted you. She said you blamed me already, and hearing from me would make your stress worse. I almost could not breathe after that. Years. Years of resentment built around silence deliberately engineered between us. Then Emily said the one thing I was completely unprepared for. Claire, there is something else. Her voice dropped low, trembling violently now. The night Ethan threatened legal action, Mom went to the hospital after you fell asleep. I heard them arguing outside your room. My entire body went still. Arguing about what? Emily inhaled sharply. Mom tried to get Ethan removed from your case because she thought he was encouraging you to fight the trust changes. My pulse slammed hard against my ribs. What are you saying? Emily's voice broke completely. Claire, Ethan was not just helping you survive. He was trying to stop Mom from signing the final removal papers. At that exact moment, my office door suddenly burst open hard enough to slam against the wall, and my mother walked in holding another copy of the trust documents in her hand. My mother stood in the doorway, breathing hard. Rainwater still clinging to the shoulders of her cream coat. For a second, nobody spoke. The office seemed suspended in that strange silence that happens after something breaks, but before anyone fully understands the damage. Her eyes moved immediately to the phone in my hand. You talked to Emily. It was not a question. I slowly lowered the phone onto the desk. She told me everything. My mother laughed once under her breath, sharp and exhausted. No. She told you her version. The old instinctive anger rose inside me immediately. But underneath it now sat something unfamiliar. Clarity. For years, my mother had controlled our family by controlling information. One person received comfort. Another received silence. One child got protection. The other got explanations about sacrifice and practicality. She built different realities for each of us until we stopped knowing where the truth even lived. My mother stepped farther into the office, clutching the trust documents tightly against her chest, like they could still hold the family together if she squeezed hard enough. "Claire, you need to understand the position we were in." I stared at her for a long moment. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not weak exactly. Just worn down by years of carrying choices nobody should have had to make, and then convincing herself they were reasonable. "You decided my life had a lower return on investment," I said quietly. Her face tightened instantly. "That is not fair." "No," I replied softly. None of this was... Thunder rolled outside again. Lower now, farther away. The storm was finally beginning to move past the city. My mother sat down slowly across from me, and for the first time in my entire life, she looked uncertain of herself. Growing up, she always had answers ready. Excuses wrapped in calm voices and folded napkins and perfectly organized dinners. But now there was only exhaustion. "When you got sick," she said carefully, "everything became terrifying all at once. Your father's investments were unstable. Emily's business launch had already consumed money. We could not recover, and your treatments kept expanding." Her voice cracked slightly on the last sentence. "Every doctor gave us different answers. Every bill got larger. I stopped sleeping." I listened without interrupting because somewhere beneath my anger, I recognized the truth hiding inside her fear. Not the choices. Those were still hers. But fear changes people slowly, like water wearing down stone. "So you chose the child you thought would survive," I said. Tears filled her eyes immediately. "No, I chose the child I thought would collapse without us." The words hit differently than I expected, not because they erased anything, but because they exposed something uglier underneath it all. Emily had been protected because my parents believed she was fragile. I had been abandoned because they believed I could endure it. Strength, in our family, had become permission to neglect me. My mother finally looked down at her hands. "I told myself you would hate me less if you lived through it." The room went very still after that. I thought about the nights I sat alone in my apartment eating crackers because treatment made real food unbearable. The mornings I drove myself to appointments with blankets in the back seat because I never knew if I would be strong enough to drive home afterward. The birthdays nobody called because they assumed I wanted privacy. Strength had become isolation disguised as respect. My phone buzzed softly again on the desk. A text from Emily. "Mom left the house before I could stop her. Please do not punish yourself trying to fix us anymore." I stared at the message for a long moment before locking the screen. Then I looked back at my mother sitting across from me in exhausted silence and realized something painful. Families do not always explode in one moment. Sometimes they erode quietly over years, until one day everyone looks around wondering when the warmth disappeared. Outside, the rain finally began to slow. 2 weeks later, the city looked completely different in sunlight. Chicago had one of those rare early spring mornings where the lake reflected pale gold across the buildings, and strangers actually smiled at each other while crossing the street. I notice things like that now. Little ordinary moments. Steam rising from coffee carts. A father tying his daughter's shoe outside a train station. People carrying flowers wrapped in brown paper. During the worst parts of my illness, the world had narrowed into survival, numbers, appointments, insurance calls, pain measured in manageable increments. But after everything finally surfaced, After the secret stopped rotting quietly beneath the surface of our family, something strange happened. Silence lost its power. Emily began treatment 3 days after the insurance appeals were approved through our foundation's emergency review board. I signed the authorization myself, not because forgiveness arrived suddenly like some dramatic movie scene, and not because the past disappeared. It did not. Some wounds stay tender even after they close. But I realized somewhere along the way that becoming cruel would not undo what had been done to me. It would only continue the inheritance of it. Emily called me the night before her first treatment. We talked for almost 2 hours. No performances. No pretending. Just two sisters sitting inside years of misunderstanding, carefully pulling apart the lies placed between them. She admitted she used to resent me growing up because our parents spoke about me like I was emotionally distant by choice. I admitted I spent years convincing myself she enjoyed being chosen over me because anger felt easier than grief. Somewhere around midnight, she laughed softly through tears and said, "It is amazing how people can live in the same house and still grow up inside completely different stories." I thought about that sentence for days afterward. My father started therapy. That still feels strange to say out loud. Michael Donovan, the man who used to treat emotions like accounting errors, now sits in an office every Thursday afternoon, learning how fear turned into control inside our family. We are not close. Not yet. Maybe not ever, in the way people expect. But for the first time in my life, he stopped explaining himself and started listening instead. My mother took longer. Shame is a difficult thing for proud people to survive. She wrote me letters at first because speaking face to face overwhelmed her. Some of them were messy, defensive. Others felt painfully honest. One line stayed with me more than anything else. "I confused your strength with safety, and that mistake cost all of us more than money." A month later, I finally visited the old lake house where we spent summers as kids. The place smelled exactly the same: cedarwood, sunscreen, old books swollen from humidity. I stood alone in the kitchen staring at the faded pencil marks on the doorway where my parents measured our heights every year. Emily's name had hearts drawn around it. Mine had dates and little check marks, neat and practical. Somehow that tiny detail almost made me cry more than everything else. Children notice these things long before adults realize they matter. Before I left, I found myself standing at the sink, watching sunlight move across the water outside and thinking about how many families quietly break this way. Not through hatred. Through fear. Through favoritism disguised as protection. Through loving one child softly and another conditionally until neither knows how to speak honestly anymore. I do not know if healing fully exists after something like that. Maybe healing is just learning to stop carrying the past like a courtroom inside your chest. Maybe it is deciding the pain gets to end with you. Sometimes I still wonder how many people listening to a story like this have lived through something similar. Maybe not hospitals or trust funds or legal documents, but the feeling of being the child expected to survive without help, because everyone assumed you would somehow manage. And if you have, then I hope you eventually learned what took me years to understand. Being strong should never have been the reason you were left alone.